So Mahua, looking at the past 75 years, I wonder how we as both sort of people born after independence have seen the evolution of this country. You know, my most recent book, The Battle of Belonging, I talked about how we converted our nationalist movement into a civic nationalism based on constitutions and institutions, not on, you know, ethnicity or language or religion or caste or any of those identity markers. And we tried to create a deeper democracy over the years. I find, frankly, that in recent years, that democracy has been eroded. And I'm more and more concerned that when I look at the way in which our present rulers have interpreted the limits of the permissible in discourse and dissent, in parliamentary practice, in judicial autonomy, in the independence of institutions, all of these I find being eroded rather than strengthened and deepened, which had been the trend in the past. So in these circumstances, my worry is really the question, are we going to remain democratic?
You know, Shashi, you've obviously, you're older than I am, but like you just pointed out, I'm also a product of a post-independence generation. Now, there are a couple of things. When we look at our parents and grandparents, our grandparents definitely were part of the time when India was fighting for independence, and they believed at least in something. They believed this country was going to be independent, that's something to fight for, they had these values. Now then you had the sort of cusp of independence generation. So people were born 47, 48, 50. This generation was born post-independent India, and they didn't have any of the struggles of that colonial, that people in the past had got. But I think this generation also, for their children, didn't start dreaming about do something for your country or do something for your nation. They started dreaming about, well, our children are growing up in independent India, we want them to have good jobs, we want them to have disposable income, we want them to have a house before they're 20 and ride a nice car and travel abroad and all of that. So I think we grew up at least I certainly grew up, or people like us who were in their 40s grew up in a world where you didn't really, you took for granted the idea of India. I took for granted that I was growing up in an India where independence certainly was taken for granted, where freedom was taken for granted, where things were only going to get better. So roads were going to get better, you know, we were going to get black and white to color television, we went from normal phones to mobile phones, we saw all of that. Now suddenly in the past 7 years, that path where we thought things were only going to get better, the entire thing has been turned on its head, and all the things that we took for granted. So growing up in an India where you really didn't think of the person next to you was a Hindu or a Muslim, or whether, you know, we celebrated Eid or we celebrated Christmas, was a big deal. And all of a sudden, those very basic things that we at least took for granted have just been turned around. So in a way, I think this has just been a very regressive past 7 years, where institutions, the constitution, democracy, all of those things have just gone backwards, not even stood still, but I would say on the verge of destruction. So it's been very worrying, I think, for our generation who spent the first 20 years thinking, living in this la-la land, thinking we're living in, you know, India, and we love India, and we are all proud to be Indian, and this is fantastic, and, you know, we're on the information highway. And we certainly may be on that information highway, but we're no longer on the highway to democracy.
That is precisely a concern that I share with you, and I do feel that what we've seen in the recent session of Parliament totally underscores how easy it is to destroy the fragile institutions and processes that undergird our democracy. So this is something which we will have to safeguard all the more. Since we are both opposition parliamentarians, we have all the more, if you like, a responsibility to fight for what is being taken away. But the Indian people as a whole, many say, are largely indifferent, that they don't really know or care about these things. They're concerned about far more basic issues. And so, for example, when we in Parliament get agitated about the creation of a surveillance state through the misuse of spyware and so on, people are saying, well, why aren't you discussing farm laws or unemployment, price rise, extortionate fuel taxes, aren't the vaccine mismanagement and shortages, aren't these the things that really concern people? And yes, they are. Those are the things that concern people more. But what makes the resolution of all of them possible, what makes discussing them worthwhile, is the existence of a basic democratic infrastructure which itself is being undermined by things like Pegasus.
Yes, and and this is something as we as politicians and as public representatives always have to face. It's almost as if the onus is on us. People keep saying, oh, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? And like for example, when we brought up Pegasus and we said that this is something that merits immediate discussion, I was faced with the very same questions that you were, that, oh, the general public can't get it. So why don't you stick to something which is more almost sellable? So it's almost like we need something that the public can grasp. As we politicians, the onus is on us to package what the need of the hour is and somehow sell it so people get excited about it. And I was thinking the other day that actually during our freedom struggle, if you think about it, if you look at sort of from 18th, 19th century, that normal people under British rule didn't rise up. It took one thing, it took one grease cartridge to get one person up. And then you had Gandhiji, who had the Salt March, and people said, what's salt got to do with it? And he said, well, this symbolizes something, so he got people together. For example, Chauri Chaura, when he said, I'm stopping the movement, people can't get non-violence. They can't get it, right? And this is, and we unless the means are right, it won't work. I feel the onus is on us now almost to find symbolic things that can rally people around. But it is very difficult because times have changed. It's people's livelihoods have changed. People are no longer dependent on. It's very difficult for one thing to be the rallying cry. So, for example, Pegasus may appeal to 20% of the population who are digitally savvy and who depend on this and who are important about being surveilled. But on the other hand, if you look at people, say, I'll give you free geo data. Give us your Aadhaar card and give us your information. He'll give it to you happily. That person cannot for the life of him understand why it is so very important to safeguard privacy when I can get my data for 5 rupees, right? So it's things like this which make it very difficult now to transmit to the population that basic things are under threat, because it's, these things are intangible. Privacy, freedom, independence are almost intangible. Till you take a person's freedom away and put him in jail, short of that. So it's very black or white, all of these things. So I think it is a tough task cut out for all of us, but we're fighting, and we hope that slowly more people in civil society and more people in the creamy layer, I would say educated people, join us and do it. This is something no longer up to us, but up to our voters also.
Well, I mean, the thing is that it's interesting that our constitution did not confine itself to political arrangements and political aspirations. It actually sought an equality that didn't exist in society. It outlawed untouchability, which had oppressed the Dalits for millennia. It actually provided affirmative action protections for scheduled castes and tribes. And it spoke about the larger goals of economic growth and development, including in the directive principles. Now, I would argue, and perhaps this is where you should feel free to disagree, that we've actually made substantial progress. I mean, I know from my researches that when the British left in 1947, 90% of the population lived below the poverty line. Today it's 26. 26 is still too bad, but that's progress. They left us with 16% literacy. Today it's 82. Again, not good enough, but a downside better. Life expectancy was 27. Today it's almost 70. So you go down the list: maternal mortality, child mortality, all sorts of factors, number of universities, number of colleges, number of teachers, number of doctors. In every area there has been progress. It's not been enough. Arguably it's not been the kind of progress that has truly brought about anything like social equality in what remains still an unevenly structured society. But there has undoubtedly been progress in the course of these 7.5 decades, in my view. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. Undoubtedly, I would agree. I see the progress even in my lifetime, from when I was a child to now. So I would say in the last 30 years or so, since I was 10 years old to now. And the progress definitely, if you think about on every indicator, if you think about education, about maternal mortality, and we see it as public representatives, when we're talking about, I mean, I am elected from a very an area in the back of beyond on the Bangladesh border, and I look at my panchayats. I have 96 panchayats, and the rate of girl children going to school is close to 90-95%. Now that's very high if you think about it. If you think of institutional deliveries, if you think of all of those things, I mean, yes, it's not where we ought to be, but compared to what it was even 20 or 25 years ago, when you were seeing, I mean, a lot of my relatives were born at home. Right, because we lived in Assam where we didn't have that. My sister went to a boarding school. There was one boarding school that all tea planters send their children to. Today, most large towns in Assam have schools which people can go to. So I think that all of these things we don't even realize it. But there's this French thing called, I think it's called avantage acquis, that when you give someone something, they no longer realize it and you can't take it away from them. So I think when things get better, we don't even think about what's got better. We just think this is so. Yes, we definitely need to improve on a lot of things, but I think undoubtedly in the last 75 years, forget the last 75, even in the last 30 years, in my lifetime, that things have progressed geometrically. There's no doubt about that.
I would say that one of the things that certainly we should also talk about is that in some areas there's been very positive development on things like caste issues, for example. After all, can you imagine in the land that is today UP, for 3,000 years, a Dalit woman ruling, and Mahawati's been chief minister 3 times or 4 times. So clearly it's possible now. Things that were unimaginable for millennia have become possible. That kind of change is exciting. I like the fact that there are now in our country Dalit millionaires. No one talks about them. They're there and they're part of the social fabric. That there is a certain amount of economic mobility possible through education. You see every once in a while the story about this kid from a village who studied in very arduous circumstances, cracked the IIT entrance exams, and when he's leaving IIT, his first job is 1 crore a package or something like that. And you see these stories every year, and it's wonderful, heartwarming, because these are transformative. What I want and dream of is an India where more and more people will be able to transform their hopes for themselves and their children through these kinds of feel-good stories. And I would say that there is a lot of human compassion at the level of ordinary citizens in India that one sees all the time. We in Kerala have seen it come out during the floods, when people just rallied around to help the victims, often sacrificing many things that matter to them. Fishermen who themselves are living hand to mouth gave up their livelihoods, took their boats and went off to save the flooded people in cities. You had this extraordinary outpouring of solidarity. And I think that the way in which people rallied around during the CAA protests, the way in which not just Muslims, yes, Muslim people felt that their own identity as Indians was being questioned, but many of us went out and joined them in solidarity, because we said we will not grant to a narrow-minded government the right to determine who is an Indian or not. And all of these things, that solidarity across communities, across castes, across regions, across classes, is to my mind one of the more exciting positive developments we have seen in modern India in the last generation or so.
Yeah, that's true, and I see during COVID as well. One of the 2 things again that come up. One is during COVID, that was a very positive. When you see a country which is still a very poor country, and you see very large swaths of it are still not served very well by health infrastructure. And when you saw a pandemic of this size hit, it was bad, but it really wasn't as bad as it could have been. And that is largely due to just what you said, human compassion, people coming out. And you saw these incredible stories everywhere. I saw it in my area, people rallying around, whether it's getting oxygen, whether it's Gurdwaras opening thing. So a lot of that kind of ground level first point of resuscitation or first point of support did not come from government sources, but actually from people. And you see that during every calamity. Each time you see a bus falling down in my area for example, into a pond, and the first people on the scene are not disaster services, are not emergency services. The first people on the scene are always villagers who'll go there and try and rescue people. So, this kind of, when you don't have a very well formed government infrastructure, it's when people come to each other's rescue. And that is something that has made Indians survive forever, and that is still very much there. The other thing which in the Olympics that you saw 2 or 3 stories where you saw this Mirabai Chanu, and she came back and she was feeding 150 truckers who would give her a lift every day when she would go for training. And that's heartwarming. You think of someone from the northeast of India who's just had to go for training, and if you see if you saw Neeraj Kumar, he still works in the fields, he's working in a Subedar in the army, and you think of how the Indian army and a lot of PSUs. I mean, Gautam Gambhir was telling us the other day about how he got a job at ONGC ONGC, for example. So this kind of, I would say, support at very basic level, yes, we could do a lot better, but the fact that it's still there, and that's what makes all of us tick.
There's a question about the kind of battles we're still fighting and the battles we're yet to win. In fact, I would even take it further and say there are battles we thought we won that we seem to be slipping away from.
Absolutely.
In my childhood, which is before you were born, I certainly never thought that we would worry about issues like caste and religion. The children who came home in Bombay to play at home, my parents never mentioned their caste or religion ever. And it was only when I was much older that I looked back and realized that amongst my friends were Muslims, Christians, Hindus, even a solitary Jew. But everybody had come, Sikhs. I mean, the fact is that was simply the way one saw friends as he's the fat guy, or he's the rich guy, or he's the bright guy, or he's the fellow who's good at maths. No one really actually worried about whether somebody was Muslim or Christian or Sikh. Now, this kind of thing was part of something officially encouraged by the nationalist movement of that generation. There was all this talk of national integration. Amar Akbar Anthony would get entertainment tax waived because it was promoting communal harmony, that sort of thing. Today, we find that in fact identity has become far more entrenched, that political votes are being mobilized on the basis of identity, that the government is actually complicit in making people of some religious faiths feel somehow less entitled to the benefits of Indianness than others, etc. And that, to my mind, is a battle that we had thought we had won. Perhaps those who had celebrated winning it took it for granted, and now we are slipping back into defeat. Economics, I said it's a battle that's incomplete, and I think you agree with me. We have made progress, but there's a long way still to go, and we have to keep on striving. When it comes to things like social equality, I can say with some pride that in the South, and certainly speaking of Kerala, that I think serious discrimination against people on the basis of caste is pretty much over. If somebody stands up and tells me I'm wrong, I'm willing to listen to their experiences, but I see it every day around me in my constituency, in my state, in neighboring states, whereas I accept that in parts of North India there's still battles to be fought to complete that victory and make it more complete. When it comes to economic advantages, we've managed to pull a lot of people out from below the poverty line in the last 10-15 years of the UPA government and before. Unfortunately, we've seen a slipping back on that, and certainly with the COVID pandemic, first of all demonetization and all the drama that did, and then the COVID pandemic, we are seeing, unfortunately, anything up to 200 million people having slipped down again below the poverty line. So that's a battle that still needs to be fought. The entire business of the hardware of development, ports, railways, airports, that's being attended to, whether by this government or previous governments. It was focused on those things. But the software of development, healthcare, education, literacy, women's rights, sanitation, all of that is still very much a work in progress, and the struggle continues.
Yeah, and one of the things we've seen in the last, I agree with you on almost all of these things. When we are talking about the first part that you said, that growing up we never thought about untouched, and I grew up similarly in the same, almost the same kind of milieu as you did, where you didn't bother about who was Hindu or Muslim. But someone once told me that you are obviously one of the privileged elite who didn't need to think about it, but perhaps ask a Muslim or ask a Dalit what they felt. The reason you didn't think about was because you came from a relatively affluent upper class family in India, that you didn't need to worry about it. So while I accept there may be a bit of that, I do think that kind of mindset where we didn't worry about it, at least in the metro cities and in very large parts of lots of states, that kind of thinking now is definitely, like you said, we've taken a step backwards, and I completely agree. In terms of untouchability and caste, there were some states that were never very entrenched in caste. For example, in Bengal, yes, caste I'm sure is there, but politics is not based on caste, and it's not, for example, like in Bihar or UP or even Rajasthan. But then you realize how bad it still is. I mean, just about a month ago, there was a big debate about how the governor in Bengal, the current governor of Bengal, who is from the state of Rajasthan, had appointed his relatives into the Raj Bhavan, and we said that you've got these relatives appointed, and should you be doing that? And his defense was, how can they be my relatives? They're not even I haven't appointed anyone, they're not my caste. Right, and the fact that a governor, a sort of a constitutional person would bring up something like that just goes to show that what a long way we've still got to do. And if you think the mentality, so I think that's very much there. One, on the software part, I do think in the past 3 years, India's soft power has decreased considerably. I think, for example, now there is no doubt in a lot of Europe and a lot of the US that unfortunately that we are living in the middle of a fascist regime, that we are compared to a Bolsonaro and compared to anything else. I think that there's no running away from that. You see, for example, now a very simple thing. We're talking about healthcare and vaccines. AstraZeneca is manufacturing its vaccines under license in India. They are selling that very same vaccine in the UK. The UK is vaccinating its people by the very same vaccine. Yet the UK advisory says if you've used Covishield, it is not accepted and you need to come in and quarantine. Whereas vaccinated travelers from the EU and the US are being accepted. Now, to me, there is no worse sign of India's declining soft power than something like this. How is our government not sitting across the UK and saying what is going on? And the fact that we can't do that, the fact that we have absolutely no either legitimacy or either the clout to do that is mind-boggling. Where have we come? So I think things like that are definitely extremely worrying. I think in the past 2 years, especially on the soft skills, soft development index, we have really taken a nosedive. I mean, we can't speak about democracy and parliamentary democracy and freedom and all of that. I don't think we can speak about it at a world forum anymore.
No, the $5 trillion economy always seemed a fantasy target even when Mr. Modi expressed it. I think we were on our way credibly to becoming a $3 trillion economy, and certainly the twin blows of demonetization and COVID lockdown have set us back. We're down to about 2.7 now, I think, and 3 still is obviously attainable in the short term, but 5 by his target date of 2024 seems to me absolutely unattainable. Part of the problem, of course, is not just growth but distribution. And while the economy has been growing, it was startling to discover that our billionaires did very well during the lockdown. Absolutely. Their wealth went up by 35%, whereas the vast majority of the Indian people actually lost income during the COVID period and lost income during the COVID lockdown. So I find that there is definitely a problem with focusing your target purely on a growth number or a GDP number. And 5 trillion, we may or may not get there in a foreseeable kind of time frame, but it's not an end in itself. Ultimately, it seems to me that whether we hit 5 trillion, whether we grow by 9% or 6% or 3%, as all of which experiences we've had, ultimately what matters is the bottom 25% of the population, and they are at the moment suffering rather grievously without being apparently attended to by the powers that be. So that's on the broader question. On where we've gone right and wrong, I mean, I will make myself unpopular with some of my friends in Kerala by saying that I think that we were right to abandon the statist policies that had given us the so-called Hindu rate of growth, and that the liberalization of 1991 was one of the best things that could have happened to the Indian economy, that it multiplied choices for the Indian consumer, that it also increased opportunities for jobs for Indian students and graduates. A wide variety of fields came. It expanded the realm of the possible for each Indian to fulfill his or her dreams and potential, and the growth that followed and the numbers that frankly resulted from that growth were also enhanced by the fact that while the rich got richer, the poor did not get poorer. The poor also got richer for a while. So, to my mind, the liberalization of 30 years ago is something I applaud and would actually like to build upon. You can't keep resting on the laurels of a set of policy changes that were made 3 decades ago. You absolutely have to see where you can deepen, strengthen, and move forward. And therefore, I am very much open to seeing that happen. But I want to see much greater emphasis on distribution than I've seen in this government's approach. That is liberalization plus, and the plus is social justice. From my point of view, the magic of the market cannot appeal to those who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. And so we have to have the revenues that come from growth being distributed to those who don't have enough, so they have an opportunity to grow, to enter the marketplace and become consumers in their turn. That may seem an idealistic kind of approach, but to my mind it's entirely feasible. And for a good 15-20 years we seem to be doing exactly that. Between about 91 and 2011, I would say our economy showed the characteristics of liberalization, growth, and deepening democratic rights for the marginalized and excluded. The introduction of Manrega, for example, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, was an example of how you can actually transfer some of your surplus revenue to enhance the purchasing power of the rural poor. And that kind of thing, to my mind, we need to do much more of. But I am in favor of continuing a liberalized approach to the economy and opening up the space for revenue generation through more economic activity in the private sector, provided that what the government gains out of revenue and tax is then redistributed
Yes.
to give strength to those at the bottom. That's where I stand.
Yes, I think I think all of us feel the same way. The thing that we've been seeing in the past 7 years, especially in the last, when you have black swan events, like for example COVID or something like that, that's truly the test of an economy, or the resilience of an economy, or the test of a government. And we've seen with COVID, the issue that has happened, a few things that have happened is, we were since 91 to now, the path we were on was, we were definitely on the path of redistribution, of growth, but also redistribution. The poor, like you said, the bottom of the pyramid didn't get, and one of the, whether you like it or not, and I'm not speaking for or behalf of any single government, but something that revolutionized, I would say, rural incomes was Manrega, as you call it, was revolutionized it, because here you had an alternate source of income which gave you a basic enough, so there was no starvation. Please understand where we were coming from. So with that coming in to now, I would say from 2006 to now, in the last 15 years or so, and when you had COVID, actually this was a program that the government almost wanted to do away with. And you saw now that when migrant labor came back from cities and came back to the rural areas, what sustained them, at least areas and laws, was Manrega. So that was the kind of safety, social safety net. And that just goes to show that what we need in India is exactly that, is redistribution and social welfare. And that's where I think this government has fallen far short of its duties. If you see OECD countries, what they gave back in terms of social transfers was something to the tune of 20%. What we did was barely 2 to 5%. I mean, we kept saying this is a 20,000 crore package, this is a whatever group, but what has really been given back? There is no cash. You can't think about inflation in times like this. You just can't. You have to just put cash in the hands of people, and that's something the government didn't do. I mean, if you see what the fuel prices are now, it's what the central government is doing is in terms of cess. So more than 30% of it is in terms of cess, which they are not giving back to the states. The other thing that you're seeing is the recovery. They said that, oh, we are recovering now post-COVID, but the recovery, as you also pointed out, has not been V-shaped. It's been K-shaped.
Correct.
Right. So
Some people have gone up and the others have gone down.
That's the problem. So it's been K-shaped, and the top 1% or 5% have just got richer geometrically, whereas the bottom, especially after demonetization and after this complete drying out of the unorganized sector, which still hasn't gotten back to normal, even though you've opened up, manufacturing and services make up over 2/3 of GDP. Services, if you use the MKI, which is the services index, I think last month was down. Anything below 50 is a severe contraction. We're at 41 now. If you see manufacturing contraction now, it is just from April, it is down 8%. So even if you see GDP, just to get back to pre-pandemic levels is going to take us more than 2 years. So how do you think we forget 5 trillion? 5 trillion, the problem with this government is it likes to put out something that, that is just taste the thunder. So 5 trillion, wow, sounds great, everyone jump about it. But the truth is, like you said, we'll probably get to 3 trillion, but the issue is not 3, 4 or 5. The issue is not how big the pie is, but how the pie is divided. That's very, very important. So who's getting how big a slice? And until that's sorted out, jumping about 5 trillion or 3 trillion does nothing. We're a 3 trillion economy, and out of that, 2 trillion is divided in 10%, and only 1 goes to the bottom 90. That's not doing us any good. So K-shaped recovery, number 1. Number 2, manufacturing and services still nowhere near it should be. Pre-pandemic levels, more than 2 years away to get back to pre-pandemic levels. And apart from Narega, there's really nothing else as a large social welfare net sustaining the population.
In fact, I'll completely endorse what you said and add one more thing in slightly greater depth because you've already said it. And that is there's also been this extraordinary centralization of economic resources in the union government.
Yeah.
And what's particularly troubling about that is we were actually heading in the opposite direction. The Finance Commission before the current one had actually enhanced the share of central revenues going to the states.
Yeah.
Now what this government has done is to essentially take out of the divisible pool large sources of revenue, and the cess is a particularly dangerous example of that, because on petrol, the bulk of the additional taxes we are paying at the pump on petrol and diesel is actually not tax which could be divided between centre and states, but cess which goes entirely to the
central government. 33 rupees or 34 rupees is going straight to the central government.
And that is precisely
That's exactly what. So we are
so
saying
that the states have no resources or very little resources to compensate for the political and economic priorities of the central government. See, in the old days, if your central government didn't support certain kinds of activities, but your political ideology meant you were prepared to do it in your state, you had the money to do it. Now no states have that kind of resource.
And most of the big programs, if you see your PMGYS or you see the house building, all of those programs used to be 80-20 center state. Over time, they have become 70-30 the wrong way. So they've become 30 to the center.
Officially went down to 60-40 first, then to 50-50.
So so that's number one. The second thing is with this coming down, and also when you saw during COVID, with a pandemic of this size, all states were left to fend for themselves. So, whether it was healthcare, which was a state subject, so we were struggling. Whether it was migrants coming back, when almost every single thing was left, the states were left floundering. And we got no central support. And whereas they had the NDMA in place, so the states had absolutely no control over the policy decisions that were being taken. At the same time, the fallout of the policy decisions we were left to deal with. So it was really a double whammy on all sides.
Quite right. Certainly the misuse of nationalism in the quest of an illusory uniformity is actually undermining our unity and our the true nationalistic spirit that's enshrined in our constitution. I would say that everything that has been mentioned just now by our friends from the Manorama, these are troubling developments, and we actually had a country where we seem to be secure in multiple identities, where people, you could be a good Bengali, a good Muslim and a good Indian all at once, or a good Keralite and a good Christian and a good Indian all at once. It wasn't a problem. All these identities were made secure by your allegiance to the broader Indian identity. But that broader Indian identity is now being sort of pressed by the ruling party into something much too narrow for everyone to accommodate. It's a Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan identity, which frankly will not appeal very much either to your state or to mine, and where frankly many of us begin to feel whether we are allowed to belong on the terms that we wish to. So it is deeply troubling. I know that it's going to be compounded by one development we haven't talked about, which is that there is now a decision to abandon the political compromise whereby the distribution of seats in Parliament was anchored in the 1971 census. The first Indira Gandhi's government did it for 25 years from 1976, then Vajpayee's government unanimously passed it in Parliament for another 25 years till 2026. So that, for example, the South would not be penalized for its better human development, empowerment of women, fewer children, reduced population. Suddenly you lose your seats. That didn't happen. But now it seems that the BJP government is determined to bring about this change. They're building a parliament with a larger number of seats to accommodate more representation, which will be almost entirely in the Hindi heartland states where the BJP is strong. And the worry there is not just about the politics of BJP winning or losing, it is about the question of national unity. If you get to an India where the Hindi heartland commands a two-thirds majority, can essentially ride roughshod over the constitution as it exists, where will that leave everybody else? Will West Bengal feel oppressed in that process? Will Tamil Nadu feel welcome in that process? Can we be in a situation where it will be possible for a prime minister to be elected and for a constitution to be amended with the South having no say at all? Why would the South welcome such a change in our politics? These are very important questions. We haven't begun debating them enough because so far we still think it's only going to come after the next election. But there are now increasing rumors emerging from the BJP circles. Why wait till 2026? The next census is taking place. Why don't we actually use the 2021 census figures and change Parliament in time for the 2024 election, which will of course serve the narrow interests of the ruling party, but will also threaten the unity and integrity of India very profoundly. I think this calls for a very serious relook at the political arrangements holding us all together, whether we need to have a more confederal arrangement, whether states should be given more powers and more resources. All of these things are up for grabs as issues to be focused on in the next few years. It's a very crucial time in Indian politics today.
Yes, and one of the startling features of the new parliament is that while there's going to be individual rooms for all of us to sit in, and there's going to be increased seats for probably more constituencies, there is no central hall. So I think that even literally and metaphorically goes to show the path on which the BJP is. So Central Hall is a place where people of all parties and all states can sit down and have a cup of coffee. But I believe that space to coexist, democratically within the House of Parliament is going to be taken away. So I think that's a very worrying development. I don't know if you knew about this, but
no, I didn't know that particular angle. But I suppose since the existing Parliament building is going to remain as some sort of museum piece, the Central Hall there can be used.
No, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be able to have entry into the Central Hall as we do now. That's going to be as a museum where people will buy tickets to come in to see it, with school children and such like. I don't think MPs during the normal course of business can come in and use the House of Parliament.
But they must have a hall ready for a joint session of
yes,
the two
but
houses?
it's going to be an auditorium. It's not going to be a place where we could go in. They'll open it up for special things, definitely, but it's not where we can go in and just sort of hang out the way we do. So I think that's really, that really speaks volumes about which way we think we are going. The other thing is, one thing in the midst of all this doom and gloom is, if you look at Bengal and you looked at Kerala and you looked at few states, in spite of outnumbering us 10-1 in terms of manpower, in terms of resources, in terms of media, in terms of even institutions like the Election Commission and the central forces, which they are now completely controlling. There's not even any pretense of trying to be neutral. Even in things like that, you did have Bengal stand up and say that, listen, this kind of one size fits all, this Hindustan doesn't appeal to us and we're not putting up with it. And what you saw is people who didn't even like perhaps the Trinamool Congress or like Mamata Banerjee just said that, listen, we may not like her or we may not be her core voter, but because we dislike the BJP so much and we need to keep that at bay, is that we are going to all sort of unify under this and rally behind her. And that's something you've seen in Kerala. So we're just hoping that that will also happen in some of the Hindi heartland states like UP, like the others. So the jury is still out, but I do think that Kerala and Bengal have definitely shown that in midst of all this doom and gloom, that it's still possible. Because I think about 6 months ago, everyone was thinking nothing's possible, that we're all done for. And I think there's a little bit of hope in all of this.
Wonderful. Foreign policy is something which you have to constantly evolve. You have a vision and a strategy of your own, but you also need to be responsive to the evolution of the world, and the world is changing dramatically. We've gone from a bipolar world during the Cold War to a unipolar world where the US was clearly the only superpower, to a world which may be again heading towards bipolarity with the rise of China and the eclipse of Russia, and suddenly you find yourself amid new emerging configurations. I had argued that we are living in a world that is rather like the World Wide Web, networked in multiple ways, where as a country, I may have a connection with you and you may have a connection with him, but he may not have a connection with me, because everyone is networked in different ways for different purposes. And I said that this led to something that I called multi-alignment, where India, for example, was a part annually of something called RIC, where the Russian, Indian and Chinese foreign ministers met annually to discuss and compare policies. Then we added the Brazilians and South Africans and we got BRICS. But then we took out the Russians, but kept all the others in BASIC for environmental negotiations. And we took out both the Russians and the Chinese in IBSA for Southern Hemisphere cooperation. And suddenly you have this multiple configurations, all of which India is present in, and not merely because our country's name begins with that very useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because we actually had something to contribute and something to gain from each of these configurations. That's the way in which I saw world affairs. But that too may be changing now, because China has become not only a much more substantial power than perhaps it was even envisaged as being 20 years ago, but it has also become a more assertive and even belligerently assertive power with its talk of wolf warrior diplomacy and so on. And in these circumstances, India has no choice but to re-examine its options. China is sitting on our doorstep with the undefined frontier across the Himalayas, which raises real questions about whether we can afford to be complacent or feel secure. As they build up their infrastructure, they put tanks and artillery and planes and airstrips all along the Himalayas, poised in potential anyway to threaten us. They've built deployments in Doklam in Bhutan. They have now challenged us in Galwan in Ladakh. And suddenly we find ourselves in a position where we may feel very alone, because on the other hand we have Pakistan, with which the enmity remains terrible, but which is now completely embedded with China, with the Chinese investing $90 billion in the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. So where does that leave us? I can't entirely blame India for exploring other options, strengthening the Quad, trying to get the Americans, the Japanese and the Australians, just to show the Chinese, listen, we don't want to have a fight, but if you want to fight with us, please realize we are not alone. And that may be what the exercise is all about. I see the Quad much more as a shield than as a sword. We're not, I don't think, in the Quad in order to be tough on anybody. We're in the Quad just to show anybody who may want to be tough on us that we are not friendless and that we therefore have some extra depth to protect ourselves.
Yes, actually in the last, if you think about 20 or 25 years ago, the only real enemy that we grew up thinking of for the layman was Pakistan, right? And we were used to being the big daddy there. We were like, oh, India, Pakistan, and it was very clear that over time India was bigger than Pakistan and we'll defeat Pakistan. Well, the world is a very different place now. And while you're talking about the strengthening its Himalayan defenses, if you look at China, it's not just Pakistan. Nepal is now almost singularly controlled by Chinese interests. Bhutan on the other side, Bangladesh. But if you go down and if you see the Maldives and Sri Lanka as well, I mean, all of Sri Lanka infrastructure almost is controlled. I mean, if you see Cambodia, 22% of one side of the Cambodian coast is owned by one Chinese company. So it's absolutely worrying. Most of all of Southeast Asia almost has been gobbled up by Chinese interests. So India is, I don't think the carpet has slipped from under our feet. It's not that we are not in Quad or we're doing anything because it's a very well thought out strategy. It's simply because over the last 10 or 15 years, we've suddenly also found ourselves that we're no longer in a position where even if we wanted to, that we could, we can't come up with the Indo-China bye-bye. We have way past that. It's none of that anymore.
We can't afford to say bye-bye.
We can't afford to say bye-bye, and we can't afford to say, and we're not fooling anyone when we say that we are sitting across the table and discussing with China. Frankly, we discuss with China when China wants to discuss with us, right? It's very obvious. So I think over the last 10 or 15 years, we have really got into a situation where we have to look for people who will also come and be part of our defenses to protect us, and there's no question of the sword anymore. So I don't think we're calling the shots anymore, and that is something which for us, which at least in the 80s and 90s we dreamt of being a superpower, I think that kind of thinking is rapidly going out the window.
Well, we already, as I said and made myself a little unpopular about 20 years ago, I said, why all this talk about a superpower when we're still super poor?
Yes,
and we have unfortunately become more super poor since the COVID lockdown.
But the funny thing is, when I say it, they will say Shashi Tharoor and Mahua, Moitra,
we're anti-national.
Yeah, we're anti-national, and these are these two sort of, statues to the liberal elite who are sitting there and dissing the country, and this is why the BJP is winning. And, I'm willing to take that flack. For if it means speaking what we believe the truth is, I think this is what we also need to do, is to point a mirror at ourselves.
Quite right.
And that's important.
See, I'm a congenital optimist, but I define optimism as looking at the future with uncertainty. A pessimist says things are bound to go wrong, everything is terrible, this and that. The optimist that I am, I would say, if we can get certain things right, And if we can make the effort and show the determination and the staying power, we can still create a better India. And that's what keeps me going. Otherwise, frankly, one would just give up and go away. One's got options. For me, the reason I'm here and struggling on, despite all the pressures, the attacks, the court cases, the hassles one is subjected to day after day, is because I do believe in a better India, a more inclusive India, a more progressive India, one that we can work for, as long as we're able to strengthen the institutions of democracy to enable us to do it. So we have to work. I agree entirely that if the elections of 24 merely reinforce the worst elements that we have seen of the last 7 years, then indeed there will be very few grounds for optimism. But if we can actually see a country that is trying to work for the betterment of all, that is willing to respect the human rights and civil liberties of its citizens, and that at the same time is providing the essential goods that we all need to lead a better life and to dream better dreams for our children, that I think is, in my view, still grounds for optimism. It may not be much, but that's what it is.
Yes, I'd just like to add to that and remind us of what Desmond Tutu said. He said, "I'm not an optimist, I'm a prisoner of hope." So I too feel I'm a prisoner of hope, and I'd like to add one thing to that, that yes, if I felt that tomorrow that nothing would change and 2024 would just mean that you keep appealing to the basest in us, right? Because I think what this government has done is, previous governments, what they did was they appealed to the, like, make India a better place, appeal to the good in all of us. This government has come to power by appealing to the worst in all of us, by appealing to the divisive in all of us, by appealing to the fears in us. So it has capitalized on our fears, that the Muslims will come and take you over, somebody else will come and take your job, somebody else will throw you out, if you don't do this, there'll be mosques everywhere. So they've capitalized on people's worst fears and brought out the basest in all of us, rather than appealing to our nobler instincts.
That's right.
Right? So it's when you give a political speech, you or I, we can either get people excited by saying that, oh, everyone go and beat your neighbor up. That will get people excited. Or we can say, listen, this is all the good we have to do. Can you please get motivated and go and help someone? So there's always two choices, and it depends on a government as on an individual which choice we make. So I really hope in 24 that this country makes the right choice. But I also think the fact that people like you and I, in spite of everything, are surviving, and we've been elected and are sitting in parliament today is itself good news and grounds for optimism. So I think that's important, because you can have a little boy coming from anywhere, studying, cracking an IIT and becoming an engineer or becoming a doctor, but it's very difficult even today in India to come in and get elected as a politician if you don't have huge amounts of resources or your parents are not politicians. So the fact that we've come in literally as sort of googlies and survived is, I think, grounds for optimism.